That's a minute you'll never get back, Steve.
So welcome you all. And given that we have a larger panel than the ones that we had so far, let me welcome each of you, and perhaps you can say, how about if each of you say a few words, starting with you, John.
Okay. Well, certainly it's been a very eventful time in British politics, but I think we could say that over certainly the last 5-6 years, possibly the last 10. I was just looking at the Electoral Fortunes because it's much in the news at the moment about, you know, is Boris finished? Can he win another election? Is Keir Starmer bringing the Labour Party back? So I thought it deserved a little bit of analysis. Bearing in mind, Labour has lost the last 4 elections, so they haven't won an election since 2016, which is a considerable period. But if we look at the Conservatives, in 2010, a coalition with the Lib Dems. In 2015, a very small majority, and of course, in May 2016, in 2017, they lost that majority. But along came Boris Johnson, and in 2019, he had a landslide, an 80-seat majority. So I think most Conservatives, and probably most people in the country, felt that Boris Johnson was odds on for winning the next election, 2024, if it goes that long. And I think most people in the country still have grave doubts about the Labour Party in many ways. But I also think it's true to say that the last few weeks have shown us how toxic these issues of sleaze still are with the electorate. Has this made a big difference? Because what we've seen in the polls is the Conservatives lose a very, very considerable lead that they've had over some time, though it's been shrinking somewhat, a little bit up and down, but shrinking really over the last 6-9 months. What's going to happen? We don't really know, but we do know some things. We know if we look at the polling, it says that Labour is now about 8 points ahead. But what does that really mean? Because if we look at the situation, the Labour Party has to win 124 seats to achieve an overall majority of 1. It's unlikely they could govern with a majority of 1, even if they achieved it, given that not everybody lines up behind the leader. Labour needs a swing of 10.52%. That's larger than the uniform swing that Tony Blair achieved. And contrary to popular belief, it's actually 5 times more than the 2% swing Jeremy Corbyn achieved in 2017. And if Labour can't manage to break back into Scotland, which seems unlikely that they will, so if you take Scottish seats out of the equation, they need a swing of 13.8%, and that's greater than Labour achieved in 1945. So that gives you a little bit of perspective. If you look at a uniform swing, how difficult this is. This is a mountain to climb. And even if they, even if you look at the average polling position from the start of this month, which has been much improved for Labour, you'd still only be looking at a hung parliament with 276 seats for each of the 2 main parties, and then reducing through right down to 1 seat for the Greens again. So the polls would tell us, the electoral maths would tell us, whatever the polls are telling us about the storm clouds circling around Boris's head, it's unlikely at this point in time to be delivering a victory for Labour. Labour has certainly been making progress and detoxifying itself, but my view is there is still a long way to go. I said last year I thought Keir Starmer was a good and a decent man. I think he's absolutely genuine now about, and always has been, about wanting to deal with that inspection, that scourge of anti-Semitism. But I think he's not found his voice with which to communicate with the electorate. And voting is an emotional act, and he hasn't managed to make that connection with the electorate's emotions yet. I'm not saying he can't, I'm just saying he hasn't. Whereas I think Boris has done something that was very successful in that he has forged a view of the world in the voters' minds through which policy is filtered. So it's like a culture war. What he's saying is, well, sure, there are bad things, but remember, things could be a lot worse under the opposition. And that's because he's managed to get across this view that Labour would represent a threat to our very way of life, to our very identity. And therefore, he's been able to do this because of the very existence of Jeremy Corbyn as the leader of the Labour Party. And these fears can easily translate in the public's mind, I think, to fear about loss of jobs, loss of a secure income, loss of school places, a lack of doctors, etc. So not only does Keir Starmer still have a job to continue to reform the Labour Party, and there's still a lot to do there, we shouldn't underestimate it. I don't underestimate how difficult it is for him. And this ideological division in the Labour Party between hard left and then centre left, soft left, has been there since, well, forever, and certainly before 1948. And then we saw it again with militant in the 80s. And now we've seen it with momentum. Will it go away? Interestingly, the Conservatives have their own ideological divide, which fundamentally, I think, was characterised by the European Reform Review Group, the ERG. And I think it's because David Cameron realised they weren't going to go away, that he offered a referendum. I think he thought they would definitely win it. And the defining issue was Brexit. But Boris is very interesting because I would think that most Conservatives are quite pleased, are happy with Brexit. And I think the public wanted it over and done with, despite how close that referendum was. Once it was done, they wanted it done. And so I think what Boris has done is turn things on the head a bit with Tory ideology, because they've fundamentally always been seen or had the aim of being a low tax, small state party, a party that therefore where public spending is very tightly controlled or reduced. Of course, what Boris promised in the election, besides get Brexit done, was more hospitals would be built, more school places would be available. He would spend more on police numbers, increase police numbers. And what he has done is the first real terms increase in spending on the public sector, on the state, in a very long time, certainly since the Labour government left office, the highest tax burden in 70 years, and a form of Brexit that in practice seems to mean more regulation and a bigger, not a smaller state. So that is contrary to what has fundamentally been the Tory direction of travel in the past. But I think it's a very important part of them staying in power, because the people who voted for them, the Red Wall in particular, they wanted Brexit done, but they do not want spending cuts. And I don't think the Conservative MPs in those seats want to go to their electorate and justify spending cuts. And that rebellion we just saw recently on social care was actually a rebellion by Tory backbenchers about it not being generous enough, not spending enough. So there's this state of flux. What is the ideological divide now for the Conservatives? How obvious is it? I'm not the person in the position to answer that. But equally, I don't think Boris Johnson, I think reports of his demise will be a little premature. There's three possibilities for him. He could recover and continue and win the next election. That is perfectly possible, I think. He could be forced out, a leadership election. I think that's unlikely unless more disasters befall him. or he could carry on. And he could step aside in a year's time, a new leader come in, leaves with dignity, he's run out of road, but he's not kind of being sacked. There is three options. Which of them will happen? I think the first and the third are the most likely. I think actually being forced out on a leadership election now is unlikely. I do think that leadership really matters. So the factors I would point to is look at the polls. What do they tell us? They don't tell us that the next election is going to turn everything on its head. Certainly not at the moment. Look at leadership. It really matters. I think Keir Starmer is not at a breakthrough point yet. I think he's doing a reasonable job, and certainly is a huge, huge step forward on Corbyn. It could not be denied. However, he hasn't yet made that connection. Jeremy Corbyn made that connection, but for all the wrong reasons. And we saw what the electorate did to him. He has a lot to answer for the situation that Labour has found itself in. The worst defeat since 1935, possibly the worst defeat ever for the Labour Party, and very hard to recover from, certainly in one term, extremely difficult. So leadership is the focus. And leadership matters, because only strong and good leadership that adheres to the fundamental principles of a party and reaches out to the electorate and makes that emotional contact that allows them to talk about policy and that overcomes the kind of bad press they can get. Only that kind of leadership can change things, which is why the leader of the Labour Party is so important to change what Corbyn did to the party. It's the reason why the Conservative leader, the Conservative Prime Minister, is so important if the party is going to continue on the trajectory it's been on, which since Boris has certainly been a winning trajectory. But before that, although the country didn't want Labour, they certainly weren't certain about the Conservatives, because until Boris, there was no real working majority without doing deals with others. So certainly we live in extraordinary times. Certainly leadership matters. These ideological divides are still there. They look a little blurred at the moment, but we know they come back, and they come back like COVID.
Thank you, John. Thank you. That's a great kickstart. Mary Robinson.
Well, thank you. And it was really interesting. Thank you, Joan, because you really did take us on a tour of where we've been over the past few years. And having been elected for the first time 6 years ago in 2015, it does feel as if from year to year we have been faced with the most massive challenges. Interestingly, I mean, to discuss it from the point of view of the Conservative majority and the last election, I mean, 2 years ago, we were just 1 week out from the election where Boris won that, the Conservatives won that massive landslide victory, if you like, and put us in a position where we could do what people wanted us to do, which was to get the Brexit done, as they said, and get it out of the way. And that was really where we were thinking. So that was, 2 years ago last week. 2 years ago next week, I was getting onto a plane to go to visit my daughter for Christmas. So when I passed through Hong Kong airport on the way to Melbourne, it did not occur to me that actually Brexit and how we dealt with Brexit the following year wouldn't be the major issue that we were facing, but COVID would be. And that has turned so much on its head. So in terms of the political angle and how politics has carried on, it has all been through the angle of the COVID response, and not Brexit. And interestingly, I caught a little bit of last year's event, and it was kind of a feeling almost of, well, COVID's kind of almost done, and we can move on. But we just know now that that's not at all where we are. And so politically speaking, having the such a great majority throughout COVID, hasn't been the most relevant thing, because in very many ways the issues of dealing with COVID have been joint issues. So Labour's in many respects wanted the same outcome, and it's been supportive of very many of the policies that were brought forward. Joan speaks quite rightly about the massive increase in public sector spending, which on the face of it would not seem to be the way that we would Conservative government would take things forward, but cast it in the light of the COVID response, and there it sits, as does the response in terms of putting a premium on taxation in order to put into health and social care, to get that level of investment there to cope with COVID, which is exactly what we've had to do. So it's been interesting that the two parties have really been quite collegiate in many areas over the past 2 years, and that would certainly be my take on it. But as with all things, they can quite easily be derailed, and a lot of this I've got to, I always bear in mind that as a Conservative, I just feel that government should be very light touch, because people have their lives to live. They just want to get on with it in generally speaking, and they want decisions to be made that aren't going to be high impact on them. But the decisions that have had to be made over the past year or two have been decisions that have affected people's lives, and in quite dramatic ways, and they've come at a cost as well. So the £70 billion that went into the furlough scheme to keep 11 million people in employment was really huge amount of spending that went in for that particular purpose. And I just think when I'm going through all of this and contemplating the reasons why we're in the place that perhaps the UK is in now, facing potentially another wave, and facing potentially, depending on the vote this week, further restrictions that it looks quite likely that we will be getting onto, into people's lives with the help of the Labour Party. So there you go again with this feeling that there's been a collegiateness around the response to COVID and dealing with that, and the pressures that it's put on people's lives to ensure that we get through this with the economy and people and society intact. But one issue that I think we can't get away from, and Joan rightly goes through the scenarios around Boris Johnson as leader at the moment, and the potential there. But what we can't get away from is that when trust in politics and politicians becomes the main focus of people's lives, which in very many ways it is now. This is the word we keep hearing. It's about trust. It's about trust in leadership, etc. It very rarely, although with I think the exception possibly would be with Jeremy Corbyn, that was a very personal lack of trust in Jeremy Corbyn, which affected people's thinking and ultimately affected his election chances and the Labour Party's election chances. My view is there is now a bit of a feeling that it's not just about political leadership, it's about trust in politicians. And I feel that in order for us all to do our job and to govern, that we need to be in a position where we do have that trust between ourselves and the people that we represent, and the government needs to have it too. So I see in very many ways trust in politics and trust in politicians as being one of the biggest challenges that we're going to have to address in the next year. Looking at polling in America and to see the collapse of trust generally in politicians there is something that I think should worry us, because then it has an effect on the way that democracy is perceived. And when we get into that position, then we're perhaps not in the best place for us to really do our job and to ensure that we have a really successful economy, society, and that people are able to get on with their lives, which is exactly what they want. Joan's really gone through the position with Labour and with the Conservatives and how the seats may play out in the swings. So I won't add anything further to that. But we do know that in politics, we can't always plan how things will turn out. There's often a lot of other things that get thrown into the mix that can be quite pivotal.
Thank you, Mary. I'd like to invite Stephen McCabe. Stephen, can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm with you.
Very good.
Wow, what can I say? I think Joan's actually making a bid to become a feature writer for The Observer. That's what I picked up from that, Joan. That was a tour de force. So I'm not sure what I can say in return. Look, this is what I think are the things that are confronting us at the moment, and the things that we've all going to, in one way or another, find ourselves struggling to deal with in the time ahead. I mean, I think, first of all, we are beset by three very threatening international issues. I think the situation in Ukraine is exceedingly worrying, and I don't think there is any sense that we really have a concerted response to that. I'm very skeptical. I think the signals about Taiwan from China should be equally worrying. And of course, that takes us to the other side of the globe, but has the same international impact. And I think the lack of progress in the talks in Vienna about Iran and the nuclear deal should also be deeply worrying. So if ever there was a time when democratic powers in different parts of the globe, people who are traditionally partners and supporters, need to come together, it's now, because I think we have three major issues confronting us. And in fact, we are probably almost certainly a bit distracted from those issues because of the pandemic. But, you know, any one of those, I think, could end being a major problem. So I think that's the first thing that preoccupies me. Secondly, I mean, I think the British economy is heading for some very difficult times ahead. I, don't know if this would have been different with somebody else in power or not, because I suspect the pandemic has governed most of this. But the reality is we are running into the worst possible cocktail of conditions. Borrowings at its hilt just about. Inflation is rising. Interest rates will inevitably rise as well at some point. There is a limited amount of things the Bank of England will be able to do. It can stop quantitative easing, but a lot of the inflationary pressures are worldwide, so there will be a limit to what it can do. And the age-old demands for improved growth and productivity are there again, but there's no sign that we're going to see them. So I think, there is a major problem there. I also think, Mary talked about the money that's been spent, and there's no denying a lot's been spent. But I think I have a real sense, and again, this may be the pandemic that's affected the thinking here. I'm not sure. I suppose if I'm charitable, I'm going to say it is. But I think there's a real failure to address the kind of modernisation demands that are needed on the police and criminal justice system at all. It's, we just seem to have lost track of the kind of crime that we're actually trying to deal with and address these days. And it will not, although inevitably communities are demanding more police and more visible policing because they're worried about the basic things on the ground, the kind of crimes that we're seeing, particularly in the cyber crime sphere, require a very different response. I think we've lost track of that at the moment. And I would say similarly in health, right now in this country, in Britain, we are preoccupied with trying to stop our health service falling over. And again, there's projections for quite large amounts of money to go in now. But but it's actually going into trying to maintain a post-war mass medication model of health at a time when the whole issue is about individualized medicine, cell and gene therapy, non-invasive techniques that require less hospitalization. I don't think, we're there, and I think that will become the kind of big demand for the future, and it won't be addressed simply by funding. It requires a mindset shift, in my judgment. On Israel, I mean, I have a much more optimistic view about Israel. I think the new government deserves enormous credit for the things it set out to do. And I think the fact that this seems to be not just a cobbled together unity government, but actually quite a functional coalition that is learning to develop from the strengths of its differences, I think is excellent news. I think the economy for security offer over Gaza is something we should be fastening onto and really welcoming. I think the Abraham Accords are the most significant issue affecting the geometry of the Middle East for as long as I can kind of remember. And I think the idea of the International Fund for Peace and Reconciliation is something that kind of Western powers should throw their weight behind enormously. So I mean, I think that is the really good news. On the wider global sphere, I mean, I think there are issues that we are going to have to come together internationally to address. And we seem, at a time when the world seems to be developing a slightly more insular focus, I think that's a problem. But, refugees and immigration are not national issues, they're international issues. The whole climate environment situation is not a national issue, it's an international issue. I think we are going to have to look, because of the strains that the pandemic has put on the economy. I think the same issue will happen to economies around the globe, and we're going to have to think about whether or not there can be better international coordination and cooperation on the economic front. Otherwise, we may retreat into insular kind of trade wars, which I kind of fear myself. And then I think, terrorism and radicalization hasn't gone away, and global security in that sense remains an issue. I suppose the two kind of final points I would make are, I listened to Joan's analysis and Mary's to some extent about the political situation. I mean, I guess what we absolutely don't know at the moment, because we live in a system in the UK that has predominantly focused around Labour and Conservative for such a long time, we don't really know what impact lesser organisations can have. We know that UKIP had a massive influential impact on the Tory party without being part of it at all at one stage in the politics, and may have shaped the future of British history because of the influence it had on the Tory Prime Minister. We know that the Lib Dems have a habit of capitalising in uneasy political situations, and that their allegiance can't be predicted in any shape or form. I don't know. I have a sense that the Green movement at local level is beginning to gather a bit of momentum, and obviously we're seeing them in coalition with a nationalist movement in Scotland. So, I think it's hard to judge that. I absolutely agree that trust, Mary, is going to become, I think that's going to become a really big feature of British politics. It may actually be broader than British politics, because I have a sense it's very much a feature of American politics as well, which I think you said. But it's a long time. Although there have always been periods where there's been a lack of trust, and there's always been leaders where there's been a loss of trust, it's been a long time since British politics, and I'm tempted to say Western, but I'm thinking more about ourselves in the United States. It's been a long time since we've seen such a collapse of trust in the political movement and structures. And I think that's going to become really important. For me, Corbyn's the past, so I hate the legacy, but I'm not going to waste any more of my time or breath on that. I'm really kind of interested in the future, although I always find it kind of difficult when I don't dispute a word of Joan's analysis about the number of seats you need to win and the size of the swing and how difficult it's going to be. And obviously, I can remember in 1993, after Labour lost, being told that unless we had a radical form of proportional representation, there could never be a Labour government again. And hey, presto, you got that 180-seat majority. I'm a bit sceptical about playing Mystic Meg. That, for people who don't follow that, that's kind of like being a prophesying fortune teller. More like a tea leaf reader than a psephologist, really. But I mean, it does occur to me that there was a time when people would have said that John Howard could never lose an election, or that Benjamin Netanyahu would be there forever, or that Theresa May couldn't possibly go into an election and end up with no overall majority. So, I mean, I think politics is always a bit more fickle than even the politicians like to predict. And you can't ever underestimate what the public will do. They are very good at making their own choices, and they kind of make them in an intuitive way that overrides a lot of the things that people like us might say or think.
Thank you, Stephen. And Christian Wackford.
Thank you, and thanks to Joan for the whistle-stop tour of probably the last decade. Although I do disagree with most of your findings, I imagine that wouldn't be a surprise with being on the opposite sides of the spectrum. It's 2 years to the day at roughly 3:30 in the morning since I was elected to Parliament. So I'm literally the newbie in this call, and that 2 years has been a very interesting time. Elected on a manifesto to get Brexit done, and we managed to get through that relatively quickly, with that being kind of sorted through the Commons before the transition period by the end of January in 2020. Shortly after that, I went on my first trip to Israel with Conservative Friends of Israel, and I found at the time then it was easier to get forgiveness than permission, so I told my wife I was going rather than asked her if it was okay. So that was fun when I got back from my first recess. But then we went straight into a COVID pandemic, and no one was really prepared for that on a domestic or an international level. And anyone who says they were, well, quite frankly, they weren't being truly honest, or they weren't comprehending where this could lead to. So we've had 3 national lockdowns. Being an MP in the northwest of England like Mary, we've been in heightened restrictions since the 31st of July until all restrictions were lifted this year. We're now slowly heading back into restrictions. So when we say a year is a long time in politics, a week has been a long time in politics, especially considering what's been happening here the last couple of weeks. And indeed, there are particular days where it feels like a lifetime in politics. As a newbie, I may have been on the naughty step a few times of having rebelled against my own government. I think it's 6 times so far, and that's never the easiest thing or nicest thing to do. And I can see Steve shaking his head. No one goes into politics to rebel, but you go into politics hopefully to try and do the right thing. We might disagree what that is, or we might disagree how to get there, but you all go in with the best of intentions. Certainly, as Joan was saying, during the last 10 years, whether it was through UKIP and the Leave Remain argument or Momentum, politics unfortunately has become very tribal and hostile, and that's unfortunately led to the murder of Joe Cox back in 2016. It's led to the recent murder of a colleague of ours, David Amos, in recent weeks as well. And unfortunately, it's that hostility that comes down to the issue of trust that Mary was talking about. And the only way to overcome that is having a different kind of politics, one where we still have the art to disagree, and we can do so with respect, as opposed to some of the name calling, the dog whistle politics that have unfortunately plagued the majority of the last decade. And that's down to each and every single one of us. Consensus and compromise aren't dirty words, but it feels like they can be. If it's a compromise too far, or a compromise that someone doesn't like, then you can feel like defeat, when actually compromise just means everyone wins a little less. So trust in politics probably is at an all-time low, but I think we all have a duty to try and address that. And like Steve said, it's I'll disagree slightly, where he said it was the Americanization of politics. I disagree, because I think it's the social media politics coming through. It's very easy to attack someone on social media and hide behind an anonymous profile. And unfortunately, when they become viral very quickly, that's what we need to start overcoming. So when we're talking about issues like this, it's right that we're talking about online harms. But in doing so, that's tackling racism, homophobia, most hate speech online. We saw it earlier this year when we all thought football was coming home during the summer. And I'll talk about football rather than cricket, because we know that's not going very well for us either. We saw blatant racism on the streets. We saw blatant racism online, and that was just because England missed a penalty. I'm all for getting caught up in the moment and getting angry, but anger should never spill into hatred. Hatred should never spill into racism. So we really do need to overcome this, and we only need to go another month further back, when we saw the month of hate, with blatant anti-Semitism on the street, and whether it was convoys driving from Bradford into London, shouting what they wanted to do to the Jewish community, that wasn't right. And having attended, I think with yourself, Joan, the pro-Israel rally outside the embassy in London, that was what things can be if it's held respectable. When you can have people talking about their concerns without it descending into hate and anti-Semitism on the street, which we saw far too often. Like Steve said, we've had the Abraham Accords starting, and it's great that we've seen normalization and peace progressing through the Middle East. My concern is not only were we not at the table, especially considering our relationship with a lot of countries in the Middle East, we weren't even in the room. So I think as Britain, as a global Britain, we have a duty to make sure that momentum actually does carry on, because there's so much that Israel can be doing in a peaceful Middle East. And I do think it's a case of we all want a two-state solution. But I think a lot of the Arab world is now getting tired of the Palestinian cause holding them back. And whether we've seen it with Naftali Bennett going to the UAE just this week, that is a paradigm shift that we've been waiting decades to see, and it's really, really welcome. When we saw the fourth election this year, I don't think anyone, certainly Bibi, wasn't expecting the coalition to last, but it seems to be doing, and more importantly, it seems to be working well. And the fact we actually have Israeli Arabs in the government as well sends a strong message for all those who are anti-Zionist out there accusing Israel of being an apartheid state. This could not be further from the truth. And actually seeing an Arab in the government actually sends a very strong message on an international level. So I've got nothing but respect for what Naftali Bennett has done so far. I think in terms of where we are now, unfortunately, we are in a very challenging period, whether it's COVID restrictions that no one particularly wants. Unfortunately, I'll be rebelling against the government again tomorrow on those, and it's not because I'm a COVID skeptic. I say this as someone with a scientific background, but I just don't think they make sense. And if they don't make sense, they devalue the restrictions that do and are there to keep us safe. So I think the messaging is wrong, and we just need to find a common sense compromise again to get through and have some meaningful change so that everyone is safe. But what we've seen is questions over the Prime Minister's honesty in some cases, whether or not it's one rule for him and one rule for many others. and those questions aren't going anywhere anytime soon, and it's mainly because answers aren't coming, or the answers haven't been satisfactory. I've developed quite a reputation in recent weeks for being quite outspoken, and that can be a good thing. I like to think I'm just saying what my constituents are feeling. I'm just in a very advantageous position that I've got a platform for those voices to be heard. So I think we all have a duty to do what we can to improve trust, but that also has to come from the top, not just the bottom.
Very, very well put. The four of you have set a very good landscape on which we need to build. But I'd like to ask you about Brexit, because now that is done, Brexit is done. What is the tangible outcomes of it? Do you feel that the UK has benefited from that? Or do you feel that there are gaps and things have not changed much? I'll give you an example. The immigration coming from France. Now that you don't have a seat at the table anymore in Europe, you cannot benefit from the first port of entry rule. That is, the refugee has to seek asylum where they originate from. So the first port that they touch. So if, for instance, if they are in France, that's where they need to seek asylum. And now it seems that the French are sending them your way, and maybe pretending, I'm not sure, to trying and stopping those asylum seekers. But because I'm French, as you know, also I'm Israeli, French, Australian, but I listen to the French debates and news, and I'm hearing a narrative on the other side of the channel where they say that the people smugglers bringing those asylum seekers are actually in London. Yet when I hear your side of the story, you say that the French should stop the asylum seekers. So has Brexit, and that's an important issue, obviously, this entire story about people arriving illegally in your country is an important issue to all sides, I guess. But that's as an example of what perhaps has not gone that right, that still needs work. Who wants to start with this? I take any bid.
Okay, I'll say something about it then. Thank you. I think, whether you wanted Brexit or not, and I agree with others who've said, well, it's happened and we move on. But I think the way in which it's been negotiated since the referendum has caused a great deal of damage to our relationship with the European Union. And I think that has to be resolved, because I think on issues such as this appalling human trafficking that is a threat to life and limb, the only way you can solve this is if you work together. And we've left the EU, but we haven't left Europe, and they are our neighbours. And we do need to find a better way now to work with them. And I think the onus is on us, but I don't think that resolves them, France in particular, responsibility for doing that too. But I do think the onus is on us to make that move. I think we need to get a bit of perspective on immigration as well. You know, these illegal immigrants are vilified just by the very term illegal immigrant. The acceptable face of immigration is called refugees, and they're asylum seekers who have been given immigration, who've been accepted and gain immigration status. But it's impossible to get to this country for the most part, unless you hide yourself away on a plane. without going through another country. And we all need to bear in mind that Germany and France take much higher numbers of asylum seekers, immigration or refugee applicants than we take. So I don't think that they are, necessarily overly sympathetic. And the Dublin II agreement that you referred to, Albert, that was a very good agreement and it was helpful to us, but it wasn't actually huge numbers involved at the end of the day. And I was the minister who handled that, had that in my portfolio for a year or so. So I know that the numbers weren't huge, but it was a good agreement. And we do need to find a way forward. We won't get back to that, but we could certainly get more better border cooperation that might save lives. But I think to just relate that to something both Chris and Mary talked about, Christian and Mary, about this issue of trust, this issue of Christian called tribalism, the kind of divisiveness we've seen in politics. I would say that what we missed talking about there, though I think, Christian, you did mention social media, I think it's populism. And we have to acknowledge there was an awful lot of populism around those kind of politics around the Brexit situation, the campaign and since, and around the situation Theresa May found herself in, and then Boris becoming Prime Minister, and all this issue about, take back control. I'm not sure they're helpful phrases, and I think they've not helped in this situation. But the very first priority must be to heal the relationship so we can actually work together to save lives. And let's not forget, at one point, illegal immigration was using the Eurostar and the train lines. And when that was blocked off, they've moved to coming across in these very, very dangerous, risky small boats and, blow up boats, aren't they? I can't, ribs. We've really got to understand the situation, realise the numbers aren't huge, stop winding up the British public with it. We don't have to tell them anything but the truth, but we do have to give a proper perspective on this. And it was very dangerous that immigration was catapulted into the Brexit debate as if Brexit could solve it.
Look, I take the view on Brexit that I wasn't in favour of it, but I'm never that interested in continuing to fight yesterday's wars. So, we have left, and that's a reality, and that is kind of where I am at the moment. I do worry it will make us a bit more isolationist in outlook at a time when I don't think that is terribly helpful. On the trade thing, though, it is interesting that we have just signed a very important 10-year trade deal and security deal with Israel, which has a much greater substance to it than we would have signed within the EU. So, there may well genuinely be opportunities out there. I have to say that's probably the only immediate one that springs to mind, whereas our trade deal with Australia looks to me as if it is slightly more beneficial to our Australian partners than it is to the UK. I suppose time will tell on that. I'm also a bit worried about the implications for supply chains and rules of origin, and I think most people would acknowledge there are issues about supply chains, and we're seeing it in the shops at times. On the immigration issue, as I said earlier, I think you can only deal with refugee flows and immigration through international deals, full stop. And I think we have ended up in a situation at the moment where it's easier to look for somebody to blame than to admit any internal failings. We really have to ask why people hang around the immigration system in this country for years on end unresolved. It's not so much, a problem that we have to stop the flows. People know that if they get into Britain, the chances of getting kicked out again if you don't meet the rules are zero, because it takes them years and years to process anything. We should look a bit more at our own internal failings and what's wrong with our inability to administratively run any kind of immigration processing system. And I think when you resort to mega diplomacy, whether it's in terms of your own internal population or the people you've got to try and seek agreements with, like President Macron, the minute you resort to that, you're going to get a few short-term newspaper headlines, but you're going to make no progress at all on resolving the issue. And that seems to be roughly where we've put ourselves right at this minute.
I think from where we are, I think the fact we're no longer having that daily argument over Brexit is already an improvement. I think just as the country became Bob's because they were bored of Brexit, I think politicians also were bored of Brexit. It meant we couldn't actually talk about anything really that was important, and whether it was crime or education or health, it all took a back foot because of this I guess ideological conversation as to whether Brexit was good, bad, should carry on, should be reversed, and it was crippling. It was crippling for an economy. It was crippling for democracy. But more importantly, it meant businesses couldn't invest into research, into development, into new sites and machinery because they didn't know what was happening. Now, I'm not saying where we are now is where I thought we'd be. And I say this as someone who did back Brexit. I think, like Steve said, there have been issues, and the imports and exports are nowhere near as seamless as we hoped they would be when we were signing up to the agreement from last year. I think where we are is probably a starting point, and we need to find a way to slowly improve that, and hopefully as time goes on, that will improve. But I think it's also been a very challenging time with domestic elections in France and in Germany, because everyone wants to be seen to be taking a hard line. And I think some of the conversations, especially when they've ended up all over social media, haven't been helpful. They've not been helpful here. They've not been helpful on the continent. But I think that's the problem when you're trying to have a meaningful international conversation during the middle of an election cycle, because politics is always going to come into it. I think in terms of the immigration side, immigration was part of the reason I backed Brexit, and it wasn't a case of immigration is bad, let's stop it. But I wanted a fairer immigration policy. So it was not where you were from in some kind of weird kind of lottery, but as to what you could actually bring into the country. And if you were engineer, doctor, nurse, etc., great. We will welcome you with open arms. We're a tolerant, kind, compassionate country. It was the idea of uncontrolled or mass immigration, as I think Joan was saying during the campaign, that did scare a lot of people, and especially in the north. And I remember quite a few comments with neighbours, and I think what their understanding was very different to what Brexit actually meant. So I think in terms of the illegal immigration, yes, there's clearly a problem. The fact that people are still trying to make what is arguably one of the most dangerous journeys of their life to get to the UK is clearly a problem. I would like to see a solution of that in actually returning to 0.7 of GDP for international aid, because if you can tackle a problem in their home country, they're less likely to try and make that difficult journey. But I don't think we've got the right balance. I think it's £56 million a year we give to the French to try to resolve some of these issues. And it doesn't. It just shifts it further down the coast or into a different method. So I think we do need to be more innovative. We do need to have a real kind of not argument, but serious discussion as to how we can address it. And I think Steve said, it comes down to an international agreement, because when you look at where a lot of the immigration is coming from, it is where there are some serious issues, and whether that's war, famine, drought, there is so much out there that needs to be addressed, and it can't just be a case of, I'm sorry, we're full, we're not taking anyone more in. So sorry about that traffic. It just needs to be a very serious conversation, but we need to be having that now, really.
But they were sending the tanks in.
On the motorway.
Parliamentary office, but.
Mary, would you like to contribute to that, or shall I?
Yes, just a few thoughts, if I may, because you did ask about the tangible outcomes and benefits for the UK, and of course, I think in a lot of people's minds, Steve has rightly mentioned the ability to forge different and more numerous and quicker trading relationships around the world with different partners. But one of the early benefits that people would see would have been exactly around the European Medicines Agency and the fact that we were able to act quite quickly on our vaccine programme. And that was a very early pointer, really, in terms of what we were able to do. And I think that the ability to get those vaccines out quickly at the beginning of last year was really did say that we can do things differently. The immigration, really, this is a real worry, because 26,000 people crossed the channel in small boats last year, it's estimated. And you rightly speak, Albert, about the conflict, if you like, in narrative between France and the UK, and people smuggling from London, because we know that this is driven by gangs. This is it's a very highly manipulated market, and driven by gangs and trading in human misery, which is why we have to find a way to address it. And we'll address it through, it won't just be about money to France, it will be about building better relationships. I am also concerned about it from the point of view of the wider perspective in terms of foreign policy and geopolitical usage of migration. We've seen that on the border of Poland and Belarus, and just how dangerous that can be when people are manipulated to move across continents and across countries, with the promise that they will get to, in that case for many people, to the UK. It is terribly evil trade, and it's a manipulative trade, which we've got to get some relationships, better relationships to deal with right across Europe.
Thank you. Time goes fast when you are having fun, and it is time already to open the floor to our members. So I'm going to ask Alan Howe. Alan, you there?
Yes,
Alan?
I am aware. Can you hear me?
Very good. Very
Okay.
good. You still haven't gone to sleep, because it's late here. It's exactly 11:30 p.m. But I reassure you, Alan is right next door to me, so he's not asleep. Alan,
Okay.
the floor is yours.
Okay, I don't know most of you, but I do know Joan, of course. G'day, Joan.
Hi, Alan. Hello.
Now, mate, I'll ask you a hard question. Surely the TUC and the Labor Party have been historically aligned, even if they're not, embedded in each other's cultures these days. Now, last year, the TUC, representing 6 million workers, most of whom you would assume would vote Labor, were there in a sea of Palestinian flags condemning Israel for being an apartheid state. And to what degree does that represent UK workers' opinion?
I don't really believe it does. I think the TUC, like the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn, became infected with this. I think the waving of the flags and does no favours for the Palestinians. It's delivered nothing for them, using them as this symbolic sign of your politics, which is what I think happens. So you know, the hard left, for whom they always have to have a victim, who are, you know, this is about what they see as their anti-imperialist politics. And Palestine is the victim, and Israel, America, and the UK also are the imperialists. And if they raise a Palestinian flag, it's a symbol of all of their politics. And it is there in Labour Party activists who all joined en masse, who really belonged to a motley collection of hard left parties prior to Jeremy Corbyn, although there's always been that strand in the Labour Party, Alan, but they have been marginalised previously. But, you know, Socialist Workers' Party, Workers' Revolutionary Party, Tusk, I mean, you know, the whole panoply of hard left parties. And the same is there in the TUC. I don't think it represents ordinary trade union members at all. No. And I think, I think the good news, and it's things that I think Steve in particular has referred to, is that the partnership agreement with Israel. I think the government's to be congratulated on that. I think it's a really good and positive step. I think we have to say that the government and the cabinet are probably most solidly supportive of Israel. We've seen for a very long time. Certainly Tony Blair and Gordon Brown and Harold Wilson, there's a strong Labour tradition of being friends and supportive of Israel. But I think it's probably true that almost every member of the cabinet is supportive. But the other thing is, I think Keir Starmer is leading the Labour Party towards a much more balanced Middle East policy. And that is really very necessary if we're to move away from this situation that you've just described. It happened at the Labour Party conference in, I think it was 2017, 2018 maybe, 2017. And it was totally and utterly shocking to witness. And it's wrong. It doesn't help anybody. It does nothing to further the cause of peace. And I think what the 2017 election, 2019 election showed you, it doesn't represent the views of just normal, ordinary people. That's not how they think and feel.
Steve McCabe, we've not met each other. G'day. Can I ask you? Joan said earlier that most people have doubts about the Labor Party. What are they?
Well, I think what Joan, better get her to clarify this, but I think what Joan was referring to was that the Jeremy Corbyn period and the anti-Semitism that flowed from that, and some of the other issues that the public quite clearly rejected about Jeremy Corbyn. There are doubts about whether he would stand up for the security of the country. There are doubts about his patriotism. I think that whole era did a great deal of damage to confidence in the Labour Party. And you have to remember, this is a party that had lost an election after a period in government where our fortunes were already on a downward trajectory. And then we quite visibly took a lurch to the left, which was way out of touch with where the bulk of the British public are. I think that's what Joan was referring to. And if you're a party that's been in that position, as we've seen, in the past, you saw it with Bill Clinton after a long period of the Democrats being out of power in America. You saw it with Tony Blair after a long period of Labour being out of power in this country. And I think to some extent you may be seeing something similar with the coalition in Israel at the moment. If you're in that position, then one of the preconditions of getting back into power is you have to re-establish a relationship of trust with the public. They have to rediscover a confidence in you that they haven't had for a period of time. And I think that is the challenge for Labour at the moment. It's not good enough for Labour for Boris Johnson to fail. That is only one half of the equation. The other half of the equation is Labour have to look sufficiently credible, believable, and attractive for people to want to vote for them. So, you know, one part of winning an election is the gain you get from the negativity that the government generates as it's failing, but the other half of it is the positivity that you attract because people are ready for you.
And can I ask, Christian Wakeford, can I ask you this? The UK is a signatory to the nuclear deal with Iran, or it was, and earlier we spoke to Nahum Barnea, who agreed that Israelis saw it as blackmail, that deal, and certainly saw some flaws in the original Obama deal. Philip Hammond, from your party, obviously, believed at the time that it was a better deal than could be imagined. Do you agree with that?
In short, yes, because I think the scope of the JCPOA was far too narrow. I mean, I think everyone on this call will agree we can't afford to let Iran have nuclear weapons and carry on their enrichment programs. However, that's not the only problem that Iran caused. You know, the fact they're arguably the most destabilizing actor in the entire region, we need to be doing more. You know, when they're state funding terrorism across the entire Middle East and even further afield, you know, why do we look so narrow at this issue when, you know, the likes of the Emir building in Argentina that was bombed on the back of the Iranian money, you know, when we've seen the butcher of Bahrain, you know, now become a very senior figure in the government, you know, the JCPOA was flawed when we went into it. When it collapsed, best part of 2 years ago, you know, there was lots of conversations as to how we can get back to it very quickly, but we've had nearly 2 years of growth in the regime, in the enrichment works. So even if we went back to it today, they're already so much more advanced than they were when it collapsed in the first place. So for me, the JCPOA isn't the solution. It was part of a conversation, but that should never have been the destination we were aiming for. So I think to have the view of getting back to that as where we're aiming for, why should we set our sights so low? You know, we want to have, you know, serious conversations, and that does mean more sanctions. I want to see the prescription of the IRGC because they do so much of the regime's work in the region in funding a lot of these atrocities that are taking place. So I think JCPOA is probably step one, but we need to be going much further and very, very quickly, because I think at the moment it very much is a case of when, not if, this hostile actor does get a weapon of mass destruction. So we do need to be doing something now.
Mary Robinson, I have a quick question for you, and then I'd like to ask one question of all of you, which might be a bit difficult, but I'll do so anyway. Turkey punishes its neighbours by releasing, in inverted commas, releasing illegal immigrants in their tens of thousands, mostly to Greece, and it's suffering terribly because of it. Is France doing that to the UK?
Thank you, Alan. I'm not sure that this is a deliberate act on France's side, although certainly a lot of the rhetoric is that that's exactly what's going on here. But I do think that there are much wider political games being played that we just need to really be aware of, and that is, of course, on that border with Belarus and Poland. So and obviously we've seen, as Steve mentioned earlier, the issues around Ukraine. There's a lot of conflict that is potentially being whipped up within Europe that is being the conflagration of which will be because of immigration. So, we've got to bear in mind these are people who are being used in this way. And we worked with Turkey in terms of the Syrian crisis and to try to help them to cope with the influx that they were seeing there following the breakdowns at the end of the Syrian crisis there. And so I'm very aware of the fact that Turkey's position is a very pivotal one for Europe, and they do have the ability to help us or to hinder us in terms of how we deal with the issues and the challenges of migration. And where there is conflict, we know that there are going to be a lot of people who will want to move, and certainly we've seen that position with Afghanistan clearly, but with Syria particularly.
Look, this is a sensitive issue, certainly for you and all our UK friends. But Australians have looked with, despair and horror at the murder of Joe Cox and Sir David Amos. But can I ask, and if it's too raw an issue, dismiss it by all means, is that going to impact on the sorts of people who put their hand up for parliamentary service?
I think it may, if I can just dive straight in with this one. I think this is a real blow for us. I know that Joan knew Jo Cox too and sat with her on the bench. She served with me on my select committee, and David Amos was a friend and a colleague who I spent 6 years on the corridor with. These are people and friends, and the nature of the threat to politicians at the moment is one that I don't think we should underestimate. And so it speaks to the very heart of this, doesn't it? Would you say to, and I can say this to everybody on the call, would you say to your son or your daughter, you should become an MP? It's a good profession. I think on one hand, I've always said it's the most brilliant thing to do, because we can do so much to help people and to change things and to really play a part in, let's face it, public service is number one in this. But it is a toxic environment which people are doing their job in now, and it's one where on social media daily we receive abuse. It's very difficult to know where the borderline is between it just being abuse and it being a threat. And we also know that a lot of the people out there who mean harm to politicians don't immediately come, they're below the radar. They don't immediately come to our attention. So it's a difficult world that we're in, and I think that social media does play a large part, and media generally. So I think that cutting out this toxicity, building trust in politicians and politics is something that we absolutely need to do to address this, and so that I can turn around and say, I want my children to become members of parliament or to become councillors and get involved and change things in their areas.
Back to you, Albert.
Thank you, Alan. No one else, I guess, wants to.
I'll jump in quickly. So obviously, I've only just literally to the day been an MP for 2 years. Have a young family with a 3-year-old daughter at home, and whilst I've had a kind of personal alarm device since pretty much the day of the election, but Saturday, the morning after David Amos, was the first time I actually thought to carry it on me. I mean, I've set it off twice by accident before, and one of them actually terrified me. Having a voice speaking to me asking if I'm okay in a flat when I'm on my own was quite disconcerting. And then when it went off when I was also in Israel, I think they were concerned to see me in a different part of the world, let alone as to whether or not I was safe. I think what we are seeing isn't just new to the UK. It's an issue across the globe. And whilst these are the two most high-profile attacks, we have to think of the attempted murder, I guess, of Stephen Timms when he was stabbed in his own surgery. Think of the Keith Palmer attacks. These aren't isolated incidents, and they are all related in one form or another to terrorism. That's either from the far right, the far left, from radical Islamist groups. So I think really we do need to have a greater understanding of that global intelligence committee. So when we're talking about the increased relations with AUKUS between the Australians, ourselves, and the US, that needs to be held up. But we also talk about Five Eyes. Why can't Five Eyes now become Six Eyes? The fact that we're already having a 10-year relationship with trade and security with Israel, the fact our Five Eye partners all have a strong relationship with Israel, why aren't we inviting them into this community? And when we're talking about intelligence in the Middle East, there is no one with a stronger connection, a stronger understanding than Israel. So why aren't we working much closer and identifying some of these threats before it's far too late? In response to Barry's point as to whether or not we'd recommend a family member going into politics, I mean, I said I'm 37 and I'm relatively young, but for me, we go in with the best intentions. We want to do the right thing. People will disagree, sometimes very vocally, but that doesn't mean we're not doing what we generally think is the best thing to do. And unfortunately, terror will be there, and the best way to confront that darkness is with light. And that means we have to continue. We have a strong role to play in our country, across the nation, on an international level. But we can't do that scared and worried about whether or not we can leave our door in the morning. So we have to be strong, because that means we're there for those who can't be. So it's a strong role we've got to do. It's a very important one, but long may it continue.
Can I just say, I've just
go ahead, John.
I just think I don't disagree with what Christian or Mary have had to say there, and I think a couple of things. I think we need to, turn our attention undoubtedly to social media and the critical role it plays in the unmitigated spread of poison by right and left populists. And if people don't want regulation, then those major social media companies need to get a grip on this situation. You can't say we'll regulate ourselves if you're clearly not doing so. So I think there's a message there for them, and governments need to be very strong about it. Do it yourself, or we will. And I think we shouldn't underestimate the radicalising impact of populist leaders, and the impact they can have on their followers and the broader society. And further from that, I think Mary and Christian and myself and Steve, we probably don't all agree with each other. We don't even agree if we were or are in the same party. But our politics allow us to, our principles, our values, the way we think this job should be done, allow us to talk to each other. And I've always, as a councillor, I was in a minority administration in a coalition. There's always, and I think we come back to Jo Cox, and she was much quoted, we have more in common than divides us. And so that comes back to public service that Mary talked of. And also, as Christian said earlier, we might not agree on exactly what should be done or how it should be done, but their consensus and compromise are important. We are too tribal. God knows I discovered this when my fundamental principles, I didn't leave the Labour Party after 40 years because of Brexit. As far as I was concerned, as important as it was, I would treat it as a policy issue. And I agree, it's been and gone. We need to deal with what's ahead of us and where we are now. I left the Labour Party on an issue of conscience, as far as I was concerned. Anti-Semitism is racism. I cannot sign up for that and could not ever tell anyone to vote for Jeremy Corbyn. And I knew if I did that, I was out. So I'd rather stand up and be counted and do it myself. And I had terrible abuse on social media. I had dead rats placed on my doorstep a number of times. The image didn't escape me as to what that was about. I had a train, like an Auschwitz carriage, stuck to the bottom of my office door. My office had clearly been breached in Portcullis House in Parliament. And I had death threats where I was threatened with being shoved back in the ovens. Now, I didn't talk about that at the time because I didn't want to be the story. I wanted the issue of anti-Semitism in the party to be what we were all focusing on, the principles, the values, the beliefs, and the hatred that was sowing. But I think, you can see from those things, and I said them in order, they build until they are a real threat. And we don't know how much it will put people off, but I'd be very surprised if it doesn't put some people off, and that we will lose talent, ability, commitment, care, decency that we never actually see. It just doesn't ever come along. It goes somewhere else, does something else. And I think that's a very sad thing. And I hope, and Christian is quite a bit younger than me. I'm not sure 37's really young, Christian, but it is a lot younger than me. So I seriously hope that young people aren't turned away from politics, because politics is everything. It's life. It's exciting, it's important, and it matters. And if we want a decent world to live in for our kids and our grandkids and ourselves, for our future, then we need decent, good politicians with strong values who will find a way to work together and be less adversarial and less tribal.
Thank you, John. Thank you, all of you, my friends. That was a fascinating conversation. I see John Speller in the audience. John, you clicked the wrong link. I'm so sorry. It would have been great to have you tonight. I also want to thank LFI and CFI. I see James Gerd. I salute you, James. Thank you for your help. I see Tom Murray. Hello, Tom. And Michael Rubin. Thank you, all of you. You've been terrific in organizing this session. Thank you to all of you, my friends. This concludes today's opening. And for me, it's good night. And I'll see you again tomorrow.
Good night, Albert. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.